picture a sun-drenched Caribbean paradise, the Golden Palms Hotel, where secrets lurk beneath the palm trees. When Major Palgrave drops dead after hinting at a murderer's photograph, Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, smells foul play as a maid's poisoning and a young wife's mysterious illness unravel a web of betrayal. Miss Marple sets a cunning trap, exposing a deadly affair between lovers Tim Kendall and Lucky Dyson. In a race against time, she unmasks a killer hiding in plain sight, proving no secret escapes her gaze. Welcome to a Caribbean mystery, where paradise hides peril. Chapter 1. The Golden Palms. The Caribbean sun bathed the Golden Palms Hotel in a golden glow, its rays filtering through palm fronds to dapple the veranda where Miss Jane Marple sat. The hotel, nestled on the island of Saint Honoré, was a vision of colonial charm. Whitewashed walls adorned with bougainvillea, wide terraces opening to turquoise seas. Miss Marple, her frail frame wrapped in a light shawl despite the warmth, adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene. Her nephew Raymond had orchestrated this trip, insisting the tropical climate would ease her rheumatism. Though she missed the familiar rhythm of St. Mary Mead, she admitted the island held a certain allure, its vibrant colours and languid pace stirring her curiosity. She sipped a lemonade, her knitting, a pale pink wool, absurdly out of place, resting in her lap. Around her, the hotel buzzed with the chatter of fellow guests, sunburned tourists, wealthy retirees, and a smattering of locals tending to their needs. A breeze carried the scent of jasmine, mingling with the tang of salt. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, undimmed by age, darted from face to face, cataloguing mannerisms as she always did. People she knew were the same everywhere, capable of kindness, deceit, or worse. A heavy tread interrupted her thoughts. Major Palgrave, a barrel-chested man with a florid complexion, lowered himself into the wicker chair beside her. His linen suit was crumpled, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his brow. "Morning, Miss Marple," he boomed, his voice carrying the bluff confidence of a retired soldier. "Fine day, eh? Makes one forget the old bones." She smiled politely, accustomed to his hearty monologues. Palgrave was a fixture at the Golden Palms, regaling anyone within earshot with tales of his travels: India, Africa, the Far East. Most were tedious, but Miss Marple listened, her mind sifting for the stray detail that might prove significant. Today, he launched into a story about a safari gone awry, his hands gesticulating wildly. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically, but her attention sharpened when he veered into a new tale. "Ever come across a murderer, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone conspiratorial. She tilted her head, her expression mild. "Not directly, Major, though I've known villages where gossip suggested otherwise." He chuckled, missing the glint in her eye. "Well, I've seen one," he continued, lowering his voice. "Fellow I met years ago. Got away with it, clean as a whistle. Poisoned his wife, they said, but no proof. I've got a snap of him somewhere. Remind me to show you." He patted his pockets, producing a worn leather wallet. Miss Marple's interest piqued, but before he could extract the photograph, a shadow fell across the table. Dr. Graham, the hotel's resident physician, approached, a lean, silver-haired man with a courteous air. Palgrave "You're not boring Miss Marple with your war stories, are you?" he teased gently. Palgrave guffawed, the wallet slipping back into his pocket. "Not at all, Doctor. Just a bit of true crime to spice up the morning." Dr. Graham smiled, turning to Miss Marple. "I hope you're settling in, ma'am. The island's a tonic, but don't let this old rogue tire you out." She murmured a gracious reply, but her mind lingered on Palgrave's unfinished story. The conversation shifted to the hotel's amenities, and Palgrave soon excused himself, muttering about a nap. Miss Marple watched him shuffle away, his gait unsteady from too much sun, or perhaps too much rum. Dr. Graham lingered, commenting on the fine weather, but she sensed his distraction. Her gaze drifted to the other guests, a young couple laughing. By the pool, an American in a loud shirt arguing with a waiter, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat sketching the coastline. Each, she thought, carried their own story, not all of them innocent. That evening, as Miss Marple dined on grilled fish and mango chutney in the open-air restaurant, the hotel manager, Tim Kendall, approached her table. He was a handsome man in his 30s, with an easy smile and eyes that seemed to weigh every word. "I trust you're enjoying your stay, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Everything's splendid," she replied, noting the faint strain in his voice. His wife, Molly, hovered nearby, her beauty striking but her manner nervous, as if expecting a sudden blow. Miss Marple made a mental note of their dynamic, her instincts humming. As she retired to her room, the night air heavy with the scent of frangipani, a bellboy delivered grim news. Major Palgrave had been found dead in his bungalow. "Heart failure," the boy said, shrugging. "Old man drank too much, they say." Miss Marple thanked him, her face serene, but her mind churned. Heart failure was convenient, too convenient. She recalled Palgrave's eager tone, the photograph he hadn't shown, the story of a murderer who'd escaped justice. Her knitting needles, now still, seemed to pulse with purpose. Something was wrong at the Golden Palms, and she intended to uncover it. Chapter 2. Whispers of Doubt. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dining terrace of the Golden Palms Hotel, where the clink of porcelain and the murmur of conversation filled the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table overlooking the hibiscus gardens, stirred her tea with deliberate care, her eyes flitting over the guests with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The news of Major Palgrave's death had spread like wildfire, and though the official verdict was heart failure, the undercurrent of unease was palpable. Miss Marple, her frail hands steady despite her rheumatism, sensed the ripples of something darker beneath the hotel's polished surface. St. Honoré, with its turquoise bays and swaying palms, was no longer merely a tropical escape. It was a stage, and she was determined to discern the players. The terrace was a microcosm of the hotel's eclectic clientele. At a nearby table, Tim Kendall, the young co-owner, moved among the guests with practiced charm, his dark hair gleaming in the sunlight. His wife Molly trailed behind, her delicate features marred by a faint pallor. Miss Marple noted the way Molly's fingers twisted the hem of her dress, a nervous tic that belied her radiant smile. Tim's voice, smooth and reassuring, carried over the chatter. A sad loss, of course, but the Major was no spring chicken, he said to a portly Englishman, who nodded sagely. "These things happen." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Tim's dismissal was too swift, too polished, as if rehearsed. Across the terrace, the American couple, Greg and Lucky Dyson, held court, with a boisterous energy that grated on Miss Marple's nerves. Greg, a broad-shouldered man with a penchant for loud shirts, was recounting a fishing tale, his voice drowning out the soft calypso music from a nearby radio. Lucky, his wife, laughed, a high, brittle sound that seemed designed to draw attention. Her blonde hair was swept into a careless bun, and her sundress clung to her figure in a way that turned heads. Miss Marple observed the way Lucky's eyes darted toward Tim Kendall, lingering a fraction too long. Greg, oblivious, gestured with a fork, sending a piece of mango flying. Miss Marple's knitting, tucked beside her plate, remained untouched. Her mind was too occupied. The Hillingdons, a reserved English couple, sat at a corner table, their silence a stark contrast to the Dysons' exuberance. Evelyn Hillingdon, a botanist with an air of quiet authority, sipped her coffee, her dark eyes scanning a notebook filled with meticulous sketches of island flora. Her husband, Edward, a man of angular features and guarded demeanour, stared at the sea, his jaw tight. Miss Marple wondered at their distance, not the comfortable silence of a long-married couple, but something strained, as if each were guarding a secret. She made a mental note to speak with Evelyn. A botanist might know the island's plants, including those that could harm as well as heal. The buzz of conversation shifted as Dr. Graham approached, his silver hair catching the light. He paused at Miss Marple's table, his smile courteous but weary. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I trust you slept well despite the sad news." She inclined her head, her expression mild. "Well enough, Doctor, thank you, though I confess the Major's passing has set my mind wandering." Dr. Graham's smile faltered, and he lowered his voice. "A pity, but not unexpected. His heart was weak, and he was fond of his rum." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes searching his face. Dr. Graham's assurance was plausible, yet she sensed a flicker of unease in his gaze. Had he examined Palgrave thoroughly, or was he too quick to accept the obvious? As Dr. Graham moved on, Miss Marple's attention returned to the Kendalls. Molly, now alone at the buffet, fumbled with the silver tongs, dropping a slice of pineapple. Her hands trembled, and her eyes darted toward the terrace's edge, where a group of local staff whispered among themselves. Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting Victoria, the maid who had cleaned Palgrave's room. Victoria's posture was alert, her dark eyes scanning the guests with a sharpness that suggested more than idle curiosity. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her. Servants, she knew, often saw what others missed. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, her straw hat shielding her from the sun. The paths wound past oleander bushes and coconut palms, the air heavy with the scent of frangipani. She paused by a bench, ostensibly to rest, but her true purpose was to observe. Tim Kendall emerged from the hotel office, his expression tense, as he spoke with Jim, the gardener, a wiry young man with a guarded demeanour. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple caught the word police before they noticed her and fell silent. Tim flashed a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoying the gardens, Miss Marple," he called. "They're a sight, aren't they?" She agreed pleasantly, but her mind catalogued the exchange. Why mention the police unless Palgrave's death was less straightforward than claimed. Returning to the veranda, Miss Marple settled with a book, though her eyes rarely left the guests. Lucky Dyson approached Molly Kendall, who was arranging flowers at a side table. Their conversation was brief, but Miss Marple noted the way Lucky's hand brushed Molly's arm, a gesture too familiar for casual acquaintance. Molly flinched, her smile faltering, and excused herself. Lucky's lips curved in a smirk, and she sauntered toward Greg, who was now arguing with a waiter over a bill. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The dynamics were becoming clearer, but the puzzle was far from complete. At luncheon, Miss Marple joined the Hillingdons at their table, her invitation accepted with polite reserve. Evelyn spoke of her research, her voice crisp as she described the island's unique ecosystem. "The flora here is remarkable," she said, "though some plants are deceptively dangerous." Miss Marple, feigning ignorance, asked about poisons, her tone light. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she answered smoothly. "Oh yes, there are a few. Nightshade, for instance, though it's rare." Edward, silent until now, changed the subject to the weather. His voice clipped. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind raced. Evelyn's knowledge was a thread worth following, though afternoon brought a new development. Miss Marple, lingering near the reception desk, overheard a heated exchange between Tim Kendall and a local policeman, Inspector Daventry. The inspector, a stocky man with a no-nonsense air, was inquiring about Palgrave's belongings. "We'll need to see his room, Mr. Kendall," he said. Tim's response was smooth, but his hands betrayed him, clenching briefly before relaxing. "Of course, Inspector. It's all in order." Miss Marple, pretending to study a hotel brochure, noted the tension. Why was Tim uneasy? Had something in Palgrave's room raised questions? Seeking answers, Miss Marple approached Victoria, who was polishing silver in a quiet corner. The maid's eyes were wary, but Miss Marple's gentle demeanour softened her guard. "A sad business, the Major's death," Miss Marple began, her voice sympathetic. Victoria nodded, her hands pausing. "He was a talker, that one, always going on about his stories." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Did he ever mention a photograph, perhaps of someone he knew?" Victoria hesitated, then shook her head. "Not to me, ma'am, but he was showing things to folks. Said something about a killer once, but I thought it was just talk." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind whirring. Victoria's hesitation suggested she knew more than she'd said. As evening fell, the hotel transformed under strings of fairy lights, the terrace alive with music and laughter. Miss Marple, seated with a shawl over her shoulders, watched the guests dance. Greg Dyson spun Lucky across the floor, her laughter sharp and artificial. Tim Kendall stood by the bar, his eyes following Molly, who moved among the tables with a forced smile. The Hillingdons remained apart, Evelyn sketching in a notebook while Edward smoked, his gaze distant. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Palgrave's story, the murderer who'd escaped justice, the photograph he'd nearly shown. Had he recognized someone at the Golden Palms? And if so, had that recognition cost him his life? A sudden commotion broke her reverie. Molly Kendall, carrying a tray of glasses, stumbled, the glassware crashing to the floor. Tim rushed to her side, his voice soothing, but Molly's eyes were wide, her breath uneven. "I'm fine," she gasped, but her hands shook violently. Dr. Graham appeared, guiding her to a chair and murmuring about nerves. Miss Marple watched, her expression serene, but her mind alert. Molly's distress was more than clumsiness. It was fear, raw and unmasked, and Lucky Dyson, standing nearby, watched with a faint knowing smile. Miss Marple retired early, her room a haven of quiet amid the hotel's clamour. She sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. Her knitting lay forgotten as she pieced together the day's observations. Tim's unease, Molly's fear, Lucky's sly glances, the Hillingdons' tension, Victoria's guarded words. Palgrave's death was no accident, she was certain. The photograph, if it existed, held the key. Someone at the Golden Palms feared its revelation, and that someone was watching, waiting. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. She would watch too, and she would not be deceived. The night deepened, the hotel settling into silence. Miss Marple, her mind alive with possibilities, knew the truth lay hidden in the interplay of motives and secrets. St. Honoré was a paradise, but even paradise had its shadows. And Jane Marple, unassuming and relentless, would bring them to light. Chapter 3. The Photograph. The morning after Major Palgrave's death, the Golden Palms Hotel shimmered under a cloudless Caribbean sky, its whitewashed walls reflecting the sun's relentless glare. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned wicker chair on her private balcony, gazed at the turquoise sea, her thoughts as sharp as the light glinting off the waves. The official verdict of heart failure had quelled the guest's initial shock, but Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, refused to accept so tidy an explanation. Palgrave's tale of a murderer, coupled with his sudden demise, suggested a pattern she could not ignore. Her delicate hands, resting on a skein of pale pink wool, were still, but her mind churned, piecing together fragments of the previous day's observations. Today, she resolved, she would seek the photograph Palgrave had promised to show, a clue that might unlock the truth. Breakfast on the terrace was a subdued affair, the clatter of cutlery muted by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple, dressed in a crisp linen frock and her ever-present straw hat, took her usual table near the hibiscus hedge, where she could observe without drawing attention. The Kendalls were absent, likely tending to hotel business, but the Dysons held court at a central table, Greg's booming laugh jarring against the morning's calm. Lucky, her blonde hair catching the light, leaned toward him, her smile calculated. Miss Marple noted the way Greg's hand lingered on her wrist, possessive, yet distracted as if his thoughts were elsewhere. The Hillingdons, at their customary corner, ate in silence, Evelyn's pen scratching in her notebook while Edward stared at his coffee, his face etched with unease. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Their detachment was a puzzle in itself. Dr. Graham passed by, pausing to exchange pleasantries. "You're looking rested, Miss Marple," he said, his tone kind but guarded. "I hope the island's working its magic." She smiled, her expression benign. "Oh, it's quite invigorating, Doctor, though I confess I'm curious about poor Major Palgrave's belongings. Did he leave anything of interest?" Dr. Graham's brow furrowed slightly. "Nothing remarkable, I'm afraid. A few clothes, some books. The police have it in hand." Miss Marple nodded, but his vague reply only deepened her resolve. If the photograph existed, it might still be in Palgrave's room, or in the hands of someone who wished it hidden. An opportunity presented itself after breakfast, when Miss Marple encountered Tim Kendall near the reception desk. He was sorting papers, his usual charm tempered by a faint strain in his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Kendall," she said, her voice soft. "I wonder if I might trouble you. The Major borrowed a book of mine, a little volume of essays. I'd like to retrieve it if I may." Tim hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. His room's been cleared, but you're welcome to check. I'll have Victoria show you." Miss Marple thanked him, noting the brief clench of his jaw. Was he merely overworked, or did her request unsettle him? Victoria, the maid, met her at the bungalow's entrance, her dark eyes wary but polite. The room, one of the hotel's detached units, was shaded by palms, its interior cool and orderly. The bed was stripped, the wardrobe empty, but a faint scent of rum lingered, a ghostly trace of Palgrave's presence. Miss Marple moved slowly, her cane tapping the floor as she scanned the space. "He was a talkative gentleman, wasn't he?" she said to Victoria, her tone conversational. The maid nodded, polishing a lampshade with brisk strokes. "Always going on about his travels. Showed me pictures sometimes. Old places, old people." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Pictures? Did he ever show you one of a man, perhaps someone he called a murderer?" Victoria's cloth paused, her lips tightening. "He mentioned something like that once, ma'am, but I never saw it. He was always pulling out that wallet of his." Miss Marple approached the dresser, where a few items remained: a comb, a bottle of aftershave, and Palgrave's leather wallet, overlooked in the clean-up. With Victoria's attention on the window, Miss Marple opened it, her movements deft despite her age. Inside were a few pound notes, a faded postcard of a Kenyan savannah, and a folded receipt from a London tailor. No photograph. She closed the wallet, her disappointment tempered by certainty. Someone had taken it. "Did anyone else come here after the Major passed?" she asked, her voice mild. Victoria shrugged. "Just the police and Mr. Kendall to check things. Oh, and that American lady, Mrs. Dyson, asking if he left any bottles behind." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Lucky Dyson sniffing around Palgrave's room? The thread was tenuous, but it warranted pursuit. Leaving the bungalow, Miss Marple thanked Victoria and made her way to the beach, where the hotel's guests lounged under striped umbrellas. The sand was warm beneath her sensible shoes, and the rhythmic crash of waves provided a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. She spotted Molly Kendall near the water's edge, her sundress billowing in the breeze. Molly's posture was tense, her arms crossed as if shielding herself from an unseen threat. Miss Marple approached, her smile grandmotherly. "What a lovely spot, Mrs. Kendall. Do you ever tire of it?" Molly started, then forced a laugh. "Never, Miss Marple. It's paradise." But her eyes, shadowed and restless, told a different story. Miss Marple chatted idly about the weather, noting Molly's distracted responses, and the way her gaze flicked toward the hotel, where Tim was speaking with a waiter. Trouble in paradise, indeed. As Miss Marple settled into a deck chair, she observed the other guests. Greg Dyson was swimming, his powerful strokes cutting through the surf, while Lucky reclined nearby, a magazine open but unread. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but Miss Marple sensed she was watching someone. Tim, perhaps, who had now joined a group of locals repairing a fishing net. The Hillingdons strolled along the shore, Evelyn pausing to examine a cluster of seaweed, Edward trailing behind. Their distance was more pronounced today, his shoulders hunched as if bearing a private burden. Miss Marple's mind returned to Palgrave's story. A murderer who poisoned his wife, escaping justice. Could one of these guests be that figure, recognized by Palgrave in a moment of fatal clarity? The afternoon brought a new encounter. Miss Marple, lingering near the hotel's gift shop, overheard a hushed conversation between Jim, the gardener, and another staff member. "Victoria's asking questions," Jim muttered, his voice low. "She saw something in that room, and now she's scared." The other man grunted. "She'd best keep quiet, then." Miss Marple, pretending to examine a seashell necklace, filed the exchange away. Victoria's curiosity could be a liability, or a key to the truth. She resolved to speak with her again, but discreetly. The maid's fear suggested she was treading dangerous ground. At tea, Miss Marple joined a small group that included Dr. Graham and the Hillingdons. The conversation turned to Palgrave, prompted by her gentle probing. "He was so full of stories," she said, her eyes on Evelyn. "I wonder if he ever shared them with you, Mrs. Hillingdon. Something about a criminal, perhaps?" Evelyn's teacup paused midway to her lips, her expression unreadable. "He did ramble on," she said coolly. "But I'm afraid I didn't pay much attention." Edward shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming the table. Dr. Graham chuckled. Palgrave was a character, but half his tales were embellished. I doubt there was any truth to his murderer nonsense. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind rejected his dismissal. Palgrave's death was too convenient, his photograph too elusive. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the beach in shades of amber, Miss Marple took a solitary walk along the shore. The tide was low, revealing jagged rocks and pools, teeming with tiny crabs. Her thoughts circled the photograph. If it existed, it was either destroyed or hidden, its absence a silent accusation. Lucky Dyson's visit to Palgrave's room was suspicious, as was Tim Kendall's unease. Molly's fear, Victoria's reticence, the Hillingdons' strain, each was a piece of a mosaic, but the central image remained obscured. Miss Marple paused, her cane sinking into the sand, and considered Palgrave's final hours. He had been animated, eager to share his story, until Dr. Graham's interruption. Had someone overheard? Someone who feared exposure? Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple noticed a flurry of activity near the bar. Inspector Daventry, the local policeman, was speaking with Tim Kendall, his notebook open. Tim's gestures were animated, his voice low but insistent. Miss Marple lingered nearby, ostensibly adjusting her shawl, and caught fragments of their exchange. Routine. No need for alarm. Everything's in order. Daventry's expression was sceptical, his pen tapping the page. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The police, it seemed, were not entirely convinced by the heart failure narrative. She made a mental note to cultivate the inspector's acquaintance. His insights could prove invaluable. Dinner that evening was a vibrant affair, the dining room aglow with candlelight and the aroma of spiced seafood. Miss Marple, seated with a retired couple from Bristol, kept her attention on the Kendalls. Tim moved among the tables, his charm restored, but Molly's absence was conspicuous. When Miss Marple inquired, Tim explained she was resting, a touch of nerves. His smile was tight, and Miss Marple wondered if Molly's condition was more than fatigue. Lucky Dyson, dining with Greg, laughed too loudly, her eyes flicking toward Tim. Greg, engrossed in his meal, seemed oblivious to her distraction. The Hillingdons, at their usual table, ate in near silence, Evelyn's notebook open beside her plate. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on them. Their reserve was a wall, but walls could hide secrets. As the meal ended, Miss Marple retired to her room, the night air warm and fragrant with jasmine. She sat by the open window, the distant rhythm of steel drums drifting from the beach. Giu, knitting, lay untouched as she reviewed the day's findings. The empty wallet, Victoria's guarded words, Lucky's suspicious visit, Tim's tension, Molly's absence. The photograph was the linchpin, she was certain. If Palgrave had recognized a murderer among the guests, that recognition had sparked a chain of events now threatening to unravel. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. She was an old woman, easily overlooked, but her mind was a trap, patient and unyielding. The Golden Palms was a stage, and the curtain was rising on a drama she would not let go unsolved. The night deepened, the hotel settling into a restless quiet. Miss Marple, her thoughts as relentless as the tide, knew the truth was close, hidden in the interplay of glances and silences. She would find the photograph, or its shadow, and with it the key to Palgrave's death. The Caribbean moon hung low, casting long shadows, and Jane Marple, unassuming and indomitable, prepared to step into them. Chapter 4. A Second Death. The Golden Palms Hotel awoke to a deceptive calm, the Caribbean sun painting the island of St. Honoré in hues of gold and azure. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her balcony with a cup of Earl Grey, surveyed the sprawling gardens below, her sharp eyes belying the frailty of her frame. The events of the past days, Major Palgrave's sudden death, the missing photograph, the undercurrents of tension among the guests, had sharpened her senses. Her knitting, a tangle of pale pink wool, lay neglected in her lap. Her mind was too occupied with the puzzle taking shape. Palgrave's tale of a murderer, coupled with the absence of the photograph he'd promised to show, suggested a deliberate act, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover its architect. But as she sipped her tea, a premonition stirred. The danger was not yet past. The morning's tranquillity shattered with a scream from the hotel's kitchen, piercing the air like a shard of glass. Miss Marple set down her cup, her pulse quickening, and made her way downstairs, her cane tapping a steady rhythm. The dining terrace, usually abuzz with breakfast chatter, was deserted, guests and staff drawn to the source of the commotion. She followed the crowd to the kitchen's back entrance, where a cluster of maids and waiters stood, their faces ashen. Inspector Daventry, the local policeman, was already there, his stocky frame blocking the doorway. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her linen frock and straw hat, slipped closer, her keen ears catching fragments of whispered horror. Victoria, the maid who had cleaned Palgrave's room, lay crumpled on the stone path, her body still, her dark eyes staring blankly at the sky. A spilled bucket of soapy water glistened nearby, its contents pooling around her. Dr. Graham knelt beside her, his silver hair dishevelled, his fingers searching for a pulse. He shook his head, his expression grim. "She's gone," he said, rising. "Poison, I'd wager. There's a faint smell, bitter like almonds." The crowd gasped, and Miss Marple's lips tightened. Poison, so soon after Palgrave's death, was no coincidence. Her mind flashed to Victoria's guarded words, her hint of seeing something in Palgrave's room. Had she paid for her curiosity with her life? Inspector Daventry took charge. His voice clipped as he ordered the staff to step back. "No one touches anything," he barked, his notebook already in hand. Tim Kendall appeared, his face pale beneath his tan, his usual charm replaced by a strained urgency. "What's happened?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. Daventry's eyes narrowed. "Your maid's dead, Mr. Kendall. We'll need statements from everyone." Tim nodded, his hands clenching briefly before he turned to calm the guests. Miss Marple watched him, noting the flicker of fear in his eyes. Was it grief for Victoria, or something more personal? Molly Kendall, summoned by a waiter, arrived moments later, her delicate features drained of colour. She clutched Tim's arm, her voice trembling. "Victoria? Dead? But how?" Dr. Graham, now standing, murmured about a possible accident. Perhaps a mishandled cleaning chemical. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, rejected the idea. Victoria's sharpness, her wariness when questioned about Palgrave, suggested she had stumbled onto a secret worth killing for. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the other guests, who had gathered at a distance. Greg Dyson, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lucky Dyson, her sunglasses hiding her eyes, but her lips pursed. The Hillingdons, Evelyn's notebook clutched to her chest, Edward's jaw tight. Each face was a mask, and Miss Marple was determined to see beneath it. The police cordoned off the area, and the guests were ushered back to the terrace, their breakfasts forgotten. Miss Marple lingered, her unassuming presence allowing her to overhear Daventry's low conversation with a subordinate. "Get the coroner," he said, "and check for any unusual substances in the kitchen. This isn't an accident." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The inspector's scepticism mirrored her own, and she resolved to share her observations, carefully, of course. A direct approach might close doors. Subtlety was her weapon. She returned to the terrace, where the guests whispered in hushed tones. Tim Kendall moved among them, his voice soothing, but his eyes darting toward the kitchen. Molly sat alone, her hands twisting a napkin, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "A dreadful shock, Mrs. Kendall," she said, settling beside her. Molly nodded, her voice barely audible. She was so kind, always smiling. But her eyes, shadowed and restless, suggested fear rather than grief. Miss Marple probed gently, asking about Victoria's duties, her habits. Molly's answers were vague, her fingers shredding the napkin. "She worked hard, that's all I know," she said, rising abruptly. Miss Marple watched her retreat, her suspicions deepening. Molly's distress was genuine, but was it for Victoria or for herself? Seeking more information, Miss Marple sought out Jim, the gardener, whom she had seen whispering with Victoria's cousin. She found him near the coconut grove, pruning a frangipani tree, his movements jerky. "A terrible thing about Victoria," she began, her tone sympathetic. Jim's hands stilled, his eyes wary. "Yeah, terrible," he muttered. Miss Marple, undeterred, mentioned Victoria's diligence, her role in cleaning Palgrave's room. "Did she ever mention seeing anything odd?" she asked, her voice mild. Jim's jaw tightened, and he resumed pruning with unnecessary force. "She didn't say much, ma'am. Just did her job." But his tone, clipped and defensive, told Miss Marple he was holding back. She thanked him, her mind cataloguing his unease. Jim knew something, and she would find a way to coax it out. The inquest, held that afternoon in the hotel's conference room, was a formality, but Miss Marple attended, her presence unnoticed amid the sombre crowd. Inspector Daventry presided, his questions brisk. Dr. Graham testified that Victoria's death was likely due to a rare toxin, possibly ingested or inhaled, though the source was unclear. The coroner, a dour man from the mainland, leaned toward an accident, citing the presence of cleaning supplies near the body. Miss Marple, seated at the back, frowned. The almond-like smell Dr. Graham described was no household chemical. It suggested cyanide or a related compound, deliberate and deadly. She scanned the room, noting Tim Kendall's rigid posture, Molly's absence, and Lucky Dyson's restless fidgeting. Greg Dyson sat heavily, his eyes on the floor, while the Hillingdons maintained their usual reserve, Evelyn's pen scratching, notes even now. As the inquest adjourned, Miss Marple lingered, catching Inspector Daventry's eye. "A tragic loss," she said, her voice soft. "But I wonder, Inspector, if Victoria might have seen something in Major Palgrave's room that made her a target." Daventry's eyebrows rose, but his expression remained guarded. "An interesting theory, Miss Marple. We're looking into all possibilities." She smiled, planting the seed without pressing further. Daventry, she sensed, was competent but cautious. He would need evidence to act. That evening, Miss Marple joined a small group for drinks on the veranda, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant rhythm of steel drums. The Dysons were there, Greg's mood subdued, Lucky's laughter forced. The Hillingdons sat apart, Evelyn engrossed in her sketches, Edward nursing a whisky. Dr. Graham, ever the peacemaker, steered the conversation to safer topics. The island's history, the upcoming regatta. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled Victoria's hesitation when questioned about Palgrave's photograph, Jim's guarded demeanour, and the inspector's mention of a toxin. The pieces were aligning, but the picture was incomplete. Seeking a new perspective, Miss Marple struck up a conversation with Evelyn Hillingdon, complimenting her botanical knowledge. "You must know every plant on the island," she said, her tone admiring. Evelyn's lips curved slightly. "Not quite, but I try. The flora here is fascinating." Miss Marple, seizing the moment, asked about toxic plants, her expression innocent. "Are there many that could harm, say, by accident?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she answered smoothly. "A few, olander, for instance, or certain nightshades, but they're not common in kitchens." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Evelyn's expertise was no mere hobby. It was a potential link to Victoria's death. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple observed the guests with renewed intensity. Greg Dyson, now deep in his cups, argued with a waiter, his voice carrying across the veranda. Lucky, detached, watched Tim Kendall, who was tending to a guest's complaint with practised ease. Miss Marple noted the way Lucky's fingers toyed with her necklace, a nervous gesture that belied her confident facade. Tim, for his part, seemed distracted, his eyes flicking toward the shadows where Molly had yet to appear. The Hillingdons, retiring early, left a void of silence, their absence as telling as their presence. Miss Marple retired to her room, the night air warm and fragrant. She sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. Her knitting lay untouched as she reviewed the day's events. Victoria's death, the almond-like poison, Jim's reticence, Evelyn's knowledge, Tim's unease, Lucky's watchfulness. The photograph, she was certain, was the catalyst. Palgrave had recognized someone, a murderer from his past, and that recognition had sparked a chain of violence. Victoria, with her sharp eyes and curious nature, had seen something incriminating, perhaps in Palgrave's room, perhaps elsewhere. Her death was a warning, but to whom? The hotel settled into a restless quiet, the distant waves a steady counterpoint to Miss Marple's thoughts. She considered the guests anew, Tim, whose charm masked a hidden strain, Molly, whose fear suggested a deeper peril, Lucky, whose sly glances hinted at secrets, Greg, whose temper could conceal a darker motive, the Hillingdons, whose reserve was a fortress. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the central truth remained elusive. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. She was an old woman, easily underestimated, but her mind was a net, patient and inescapable. The Golden Palms was a stage, and the drama was far from over. She would find the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The night deepened, the island cloaked in shadows. Miss Marple, her resolve unyielding, knew the next move was hers. Victoria's death had raised the stakes, and the murderer, whoever they were, was watching. But so was Jane Marple, and she would not be outmanoeuvred. Chapter 5. The Botanist's Secret. The Caribbean dawn broke over St. Honoré with a blaze of coral and gold, bathing the Golden Palms Hotel in a deceptive serenity. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room's wicker armchair, gazed through the open window at the swaying palms, her frail hands folded over a neatly pressed handkerchief. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria, the maid, had cast a shadow over the hotel, and though the guests clung to their routines, the air hummed with unspoken dread. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever despite her rheumatism, sifted through the clues. Palgrave's tale of a murderer, the missing photograph, Victoria's poisoning, and the web of tensions among the guests. Her knitting, a soft mound of pink wool, lay untouched on the table. Her thoughts were her needles now, stitching together a pattern only she could see. Today she resolved to probe deeper, and Evelyn Hillingdon, the botanist with her cool reserve and knowledge of deadly plants, was her next thread to unravel. The breakfast terrace was quieter than usual, the clink of cutlery subdued as guests whispered about Victoria's death. Miss Marple, in a crisp cotton dress and her signature straw hat, took her customary table near the hibiscus hedge, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a watchmaker. Tim Kendall moved among the tables, his charm strained, his dark eyes darting toward the staff, who worked with downcast gazes. Molly Kendall was absent, her absence a silent note in the morning's discord. Miss Marple noted the Dysons at their usual spot. Greg's loud voice softened by the weight of recent events. Lucky's smile brittle as she sipped her coffee. The Hillingdons sat apart, Evelyn's notebook open, her pen moving with deliberate strokes, while Edward stared at the sea, his angular face etched with a private burden. Miss Marple's opportunity came mid-morning, when Evelyn Hillingdon announced a botanical walk for interested guests. "The island's flora is unique," she said at breakfast, her voice crisp. "I'll lead a small group to the cliffs at 11. Miss Marple, seizing the chance, expressed her enthusiasm, her tone that of a curious spinster. "Oh, how delightful, Mrs. Hillingdon! I do love a bit of nature." Evelyn's lips curved faintly, but her dark eyes were guarded. Miss Marple, undeterred, prepared for the outing, her cane and sensible shoes ready for the uneven terrain. The walk promised more than botanical insights. It was a chance to probe Evelyn's knowledge, and perhaps her secrets. The group gathered at the hotel's garden gate. Miss Marple, a chatty American couple, and a shy German tourist with a camera. Evelyn led the way, her khaki trousers and wide-brimmed hat lending her an air of quiet authority. The path wound through dense foliage, the air thick with the scent of wild orchids and salt. Evelyn's commentary was precise, her hands gesturing to delicate ferns and vibrant bromeliads. "This is Calotropis precara," she said, pointing to a shrub with milky sap. "The locals call it madar. It's toxic if ingested, though it's used in traditional remedies." Miss Marple, feigning fascination, asked, "Are there many such plants here, Mrs. Hillingdon? Ones that could harm by mistake?" Evelyn's gaze flickered, her tone measured. "A few. Nightshade variants, for instance, though they're rare. You'd need expertise to misuse them." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Nightshade. Hadn't Dr. Graham mentioned a bitter almond-like smell in Victoria's death? The connection was tenuous, but it warranted pursuit. As the group paused by a cliff overlooking the turquoise bay, Miss Marple drew Evelyn aside, her voice soft. "You must find such knowledge empowering, knowing which plants heal and which harm." Evelyn's smile was tight. "It's a responsibility, Miss Marple. Nature doesn't distinguish between good and ill intent." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the question had brushed a hidden nerve. She let the moment pass, but her suspicions deepened. Evelyn's expertise was no mere academic pursuit. It could be a tool or a weapon. Returning to the hotel, Miss Marple reflected on the walk. Evelyn's composure was formidable, but her guarded responses suggested she knew more than she revealed. The mention of nightshade, coupled with Victoria's poisoning, was a thread worth following. Miss Marple decided to observe the Hillingdons more closely, particularly Edward, whose silence was as telling as Evelyn's reticence. She recalled their strained dynamic, the way Edward's eyes avoided his wife's, his hands restless during conversations. Was he complicit in a secret, or merely burdened by one? At luncheon, Miss Marple joined Dr. Graham, whose courteous demeanour made him an ideal source of information. The dining room buzzed with subdued chatter, the guests' appetites tempered by the morning's grim news. "A terrible business, Victoria's death," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. Dr. Graham nodded, his silver hair catching the light. Indeed, the police suspect a toxin, but the source is unclear. It's unsettling so soon after Palgrave. Miss Marple, seizing the opening, asked about the poison's nature. Was it something natural, perhaps? A plant, like those Mrs. Hillingdon studies? Dr. Graham's brow furrowed. Possible, though unlikely. The smell suggested cyanide, but that's not common in plants here. Nightshade could mimic it, I suppose. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The connection to Evelyn was growing stronger, though she needed more to weave it into the pattern. The afternoon brought a new development. Miss Marple, strolling near the hotel's pool, overheard a heated exchange between Edward Hillingdon and Greg Dyson. The men stood by the cliffs, their voices low but intense. "You're pushing too far," Edward said, his tone sharp. Greg's reply was gruff. "Mind your own business, Hillingdon. You've got enough to worry about." Miss Marple, pretending to admire a nearby oleander, noted Edward's clenched fists, Greg's defiant stance. The argument ended abruptly when Lucky Dyson approached, her laughter cutting through the tension. "Boys play nice," she teased, linking her arm with Greg's. Edward turned away, his face a mask of frustration. Miss Marple filed the exchange away. It suggested a rift, perhaps tied to the hotel's darker currents. Seeking to test her theories, Miss Marple visited the hotel library, a quiet room lined with dog-eared novels and outdated magazines. She found Evelyn there, sketching a leaf with meticulous care. "You have a gift, Mrs. Hillingdon," Miss Marple said, peering over her shoulder. Evelyn's pen paused, her smile polite but distant. "It's a hobby, nothing more." Miss Marple, undeterred, mentioned Victoria's death, her tone casual. "Such a tragedy. I heard the poison might have been plant-based. You'd know if such a thing were possible, wouldn't you?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her voice cool. "I suppose so, but it's unlikely. Poisons like that require intent, not accident." The word intent hung in the air, and Miss Marple sensed a challenge in Evelyn's gaze. She thanked her and withdrew, her mind alight with possibilities. Evelyn's defensiveness was a crack in her armour, one Miss Marple intended to widen. Evening approached. The hotel prepared for a dinner dance, the terrace aglow with lanterns and the scent of grilled fish. Miss Marple, in a lavender dress, took her place among the guests, her eyes never still. Tim Kendall was omnipresent, his smile fixed as he greeted arrivals, but his glances toward the shadows betrayed his unease. Molly's absence was conspicuous, and when Miss Marple inquired, Tim explained she was under the weather. The excuse rang hollow, and Miss Marple wondered if Molly's condition was linked to the hotel's deadly undercurrents. The dance began, the calypso band filling the air with rhythm. Greg and Lucky Dyson took to the floor, their movements practised but lacking warmth. Edward Hillingdon stood by the bar, his whiskey untouched, while Evelyn watched the dancers, her notebook closed for once. Miss Marple, seated with a glass of lemonade, observed their interactions, her mind tracing connections. The Hillingdons' tension, Greg's aggression, Lucky's sly glances at Tim, each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit. The evening's calm shattered when Molly Kendall appeared, her entrance unsteady. She wore a white dress that clung to her fragile frame, her face pale, her eyes wide with a feverish intensity. Tim rushed to her side, his voice soothing, but Molly's gaze darted wildly, as if seeing phantoms. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice high and brittle. Then, with a gasp, she collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor. The music faltered, guests gasping as Dr. Graham pushed through the crowd. "Give her air," he ordered, loosening her dress. Miss Marple, standing quietly, caught Lucky Dyson's expression. A fleeting smirk, quickly masked. The moment was telling, and Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized. Molly's collapse was no accident. Dr. Graham escorted Molly to her room, Tim following, his face a mask of concern. The dance resumed, but the mood was fractured. Miss Marple approached Inspector Daventry, who stood at the terrace's edge, his notebook in hand. "A distressing evening," she said, her tone mild. "Mrs. Kendall seems unwell, perhaps more than nerves." Daventry's eyes sharpened. "You're observant, Miss Marple. We're keeping an eye on things." She nodded, sensing his growing trust. She shared no specifics, but her hint about Molly's condition planted a seed. The inspector, she hoped, would dig deeper. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. The night was warm, the distant drums a faint pulse. Her knitting lay forgotten as she reviewed the day's findings. Evelyn's expertise in toxic, plants, Edward's clash with Greg, Molly's collapse, Lucky's smirk. The Hillingdons were central, she sensed, their secrets tied to the deaths. Evelyn's knowledge of Nightshade, her guarded demeanour, suggested a role, perhaps not as the killer, but as a witness or accomplice. Edward's tension hinted at complicity or fear, and Molly, her collapse suggested poisoning, slow and deliberate, a step toward a larger plan. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Palgrave's photograph, the catalyst for the violence. If it depicted a murderer, as he claimed, it was likely one of the guests, someone whose past had caught up with them. Evelyn, with her botanical knowledge, could have crafted the poison that killed Victoria, perhaps to protect a shared secret with Edward. Or was Lucky Dyson, with her sly glances and suspicious visit to Palgrave's room, the true orchestrator, manipulating others to her ends? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The Golden Palms was a chessboard, and she was closing in on the Queen. The night deepened, the hotel cloaked in silence. Miss Marple, her resolve unyielding, knew the next move was critical. Molly's life, she feared, hung in the balance, and the murderer, emboldened by success, would strike again. But Jane Marple, unassuming and relentless, was ready. The truth was near, hidden in the shadows of motive and opportunity, and she would bring it to light. Chapter 6. A Tale. Retold. The Caribbean sun hung low over St. Honoré, casting long shadows across the Golden Palms Hotel, as Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of her balcony, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. The events of the past days, Major Palgrave's death, Victoria's poisoning, Molly Kendall's collapse, had woven a tapestry of suspicion, and Miss Marple's sharp mind, undimmed by age, was intent on unravelling it. Her knitting, a soft pile of pink wool, lay neglected on the wicker table. Her thoughts were her tools now, piecing together the fragments of motive and opportunity. Palgrave's story of a murderer, the missing photograph, and the recent tragedies. pointed to a deliberate hand, and Miss Marple was determined to trace its movements. Today, she would revisit Palgrave's tale, seeking the thread that connected past to present. The hotel stirred with a forced normalcy, guests clinging to their routines despite the pall of death. Miss Marple, dressed in a light muslin frock and her ever-present straw hat, descended to the dining terrace, where the clatter of breakfast dishes mingled with hushed conversations. The Kendalls were present, Tim's charm a thin veneer over his strained expression, Molly pale and withdrawn, her eyes darting as if expecting a sudden threat. Miss Marple noted the way Tim's hand rested on Molly's shoulder, possessive yet distracted, and the faint tremor in Molly's fingers as she lifted her coffee cup. The Dysons at a nearby table were subdued, Greg's usual bluster tempered, Lucky's smile tight as she glanced at Tim. The Hillingdons, as always, sat apart, Evelyn's notebook open, Edward's gaze fixed on the horizon, his silence a wall. Miss Marple's first move was to seek out Dr. Graham, whose medical expertise and genial manner made him a valuable ally. She found him in the hotel's lounge, reviewing a guest's chart. "Good morning, Doctor," she said, her voice soft. "I hope I'm not interrupting." He smiled, setting the chart aside. "Not at all, Miss Marple. How can I help?" She settled into a chair, her cane resting against her knee. "I've been thinking about poor Major Palgrave," she began, her tone reflective. "He was so fond of his stories, wasn't he? I recall him mentioning one about a murderer, a man who poisoned his wife. Did he ever share that with you?" Dr. Graham's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping the table. "He did, now you mention it. Some tale about a fellow who got away with murder. But he never showed me any photograph, if that's what you're getting at. Palgrave was prone to exaggeration, you know. Too much rum." Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign, but her mind rejected his dismissal. The doctor's casual tone felt rehearsed, as if he wished to close the subject. Sensing she would glean no more, Miss Marple shifted her focus to the staff, whose unseen presence often held the key to a household's secrets. She sought out Jim, the gardener, whom she had seen whispering with Victoria's cousin. He was tending a bed of hibiscus near the pool, his movements methodical, but his eyes wary. "A fine morning, Jim," she said, pausing as if to admire the flowers. "Though it's hard to enjoy after such tragedies." Jim nodded, his pruning shears pausing. "Aye, ma'am. Victoria was a good 'un." Miss Marple, her tone sympathetic, mentioned Victoria's diligence. She must have seen so much working in the rooms. Did she ever mention anything unusual? Perhaps about Major Palgrave? Jim's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking toward the hotel. "She said once he was always talking about some killer, showing pictures. But she didn't take it serious," Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did she notice anyone acting oddly around him?" Jim hesitated, then muttered, "She saw that American lady, Mrs. Dyson, near his bungalow one night. Didn't think much of it then." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Lucky Dyson again. She thanked Jim, her mind cataloguing the clue. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple took a slow walk along the beach, the sand warm beneath her sensible shoes. The tide was out, revealing tide pools alive with tiny fish. She paused, ostensibly to rest, but her true purpose was to observe. Tim Kendall emerged from the hotel, his stride purposeful as he approached a group of locals repairing a dock. His conversation was brief, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched when a man gestured toward the kitchen. She recalled Victoria's death, the almond-like poison, and wondered if Tim's unease stemmed from fear of discovery or guilt. Nearby, Molly sat alone under a palm, her sketchbook open, but her pencil still. Her eyes, shadowed and restless, followed Tim, and Miss Marple sensed a rift, perhaps widened by the hotel's deadly secrets. Luncheon. Miss Marple joined a small group that included the Dysons, her presence unassuming, but her ears alert. Greg was gruff, his appetite hearty despite the sombre mood, while Lucky's laughter rang hollow, her eyes flicking toward Tim, who was serving drinks. Miss Marple, steering the conversation to Palgrave, mentioned his storytelling. He had such a flair for the dramatic, she said, her tone light. That tale about a murderer. Quite chilling, wasn't it? Lucky's fork paused, her smile faltering. Oh, he was full of nonsense, she said, her voice sharp. Old men and their stories. Greg grunted, oblivious. But Miss Marple noted Lucky's unease. The photograph, she suspected, was a threat to someone. Perhaps Lucky, whose presence near Palgrave's bungalow was no coincidence. Seeking to test her theory, Miss Marple visited the hotel's office where Tim was sorting invoices. I do admire your efficiency, Mr. Kendall, she said, her smile grandmotherly. Running a hotel must be a challenge, especially with such sad events. Tim's expression tightened, but he nodded. We manage, Miss Marple. It's been tough, but we'll get through. She mentioned Victoria, her tone casual. She was so observant, wasn't she? I imagine she noticed things others missed. Tim's pen stilled, his eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping. She was a good worker, he said, his voice flat. Miss Marple thanked him and withdrew, her suspicions deepening. Tim's reticence was a shield, and she intended to pierce it. The afternoon brought a new encounter. Miss Marple, lingering near the bar, overheard a hushed exchange between Molly and Jim, who stood by a cluster of coconut palms. You need to be careful, Jim said, his voice low. That woman's trouble, and you know it. Molly's reply was sharp. I can handle it, Jim. Just keep quiet. They parted as Miss Marple approached, her presence unnoticed. The woman could only be Lucky Dyson, whose interactions with Tim and Molly were increasingly suspicious. Miss Marple filed the exchange away, her mind tracing connections. Lucky's sly glances, her visit to Palgrave's room, her unease at the mention of his story. As evening approached, the hotel prepared for a seafood buffet, the terrace aglow with torches and the scent of grilled lobster. Miss Marple, in a pale blue dress, took her place among the guests, her eyes scanning the crowd. Tim was omnipresent, his smile fixed, but his glances toward Molly, who had joined the party, were fraught with concern. Molly's movements were slow, her smile forced, and Miss Marple wondered if her collapse the previous night was a symptom of something sinister, perhaps the same poison that killed Victoria. The Hillingdons, at their usual table, were silent, Evelyn's sketches abandoned, Edward's whiskey glass empty. Greg Dyson, animated by rum, told a fishing tale, while Lucky watched Tim, her fingers toying with a pearl earring. Miss Marple approached Dr. Graham, who stood by the buffet, his demeanour weary. Mrs. Kendall seems fragile, she said, her tone concerned. Could it be more than nerves, do you think? Dr. Graham sighed, his eyes on Molly. She's under strain, no doubt. I've prescribed rest, but I'll keep an eye on her. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. If Molly was being poisoned, the method was subtle, designed to mimic illness. She recalled Evelyn Hillingdon's mention of nightshade, its effect slow and insidious. Was Evelyn involved, or was her knowledge a coincidence exploited by another? The buffet continued, the calypso band lending a festive air, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She revisited Palgrave's story. A man who poisoned his wife, escaping justice, captured in a photograph. The killer, she suspected, was among the guests, recognized by Palgrave in a moment of fatal clarity. Lucky Dyson, with her suspicious movements, was a prime candidate, but Tim Kendall's unease and Molly's fear suggested a deeper conspiracy. The Hillingdons, with their strained marriage and Evelyn's botanical expertise, could not be dismissed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she watched Lucky laugh with Tim, her hand brushing his arm. The gesture was fleeting, but it spoke of familiarity, perhaps intimacy. Seeking a final clue, Miss Marple approached the bar, where a young waiter, Thomas, was polishing glasses. "You must see so much working here," she said, her tone conversational. "Did Major Palgrave ever share his stories with you?" Thomas grinned, his hands busy. "Oh, he was always talking, ma'am. Said he had a picture of some crook, but I never saw it. He was showing it to folks the night he died, though." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "To whom, do you recall?" Thomas shrugged. "Can't say for sure. Maybe Mr. Kendall, or that American lady. He was pretty drunk." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind alight. The photograph had been seen, and its viewer had acted swiftly. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. The night was warm, the distant waves a steady rhythm. Her knitting lay untouched as she reviewed the day's findings. Dr. Graham's dismissal, Jim's revelation, Lucky's unease, Tim's reticence, Molly's fear, Thomas's clue. The photograph was the key, she was certain. Palgrave had recognized a murderer, likely Lucky, given her proximity to his bungalow, and that recognition had sparked a chain of violence. Victoria, with her sharp eyes, had seen something incriminating, perhaps Lucky's presence, and paid the ultimate price. Molly's fragility suggested she was the next target, her death planned to secure a larger prize, perhaps the hotel itself. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tim and Lucky. Their interactions, subtle but telling, hinted at a bond beyond professional courtesy. If they were lovers, as she suspected, their motive could be wealth or freedom. Tim's control of the hotel, unencumbered by Molly. The Hillingdons, with Evelyn's knowledge and Edward's tension, might be complicit. Their silence bought or coerced. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The Golden Palms was a stage, and the players were revealing themselves. She was an old woman, easily overlooked, but her mind was a trap, patient and unyielding. The night deepened. The Dew Hotel cloaked in silence. Miss Marple, her resolve unwavering, knew the next move was hers. The murderer, emboldened by success, would strike again, but she was closing in. The truth was near, hidden in the interplay of glances and silences. and Jane Marple, unassuming and relentless, would bring it to light. Chapter 7. The Trap. The Caribbean twilight draped the Golden Palms Hotel in a veil of amber and violet, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant pulse of waves against St. Honoré's shores. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room's wicker armchair, gazed at the horizon, her frail hands clasped over a folded shawl. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria, coupled with Molly Kendall's alarming collapse, had tightened the knot of suspicion in her mind. Her knitting, a soft heap of pink wool, lay untouched on the table. Her thoughts were her instruments now, weaving a net to ensnare the truth. Palgrave's tale of a murderer, the missing photograph, and the web of secrets among the guests pointed to a deliberate hand, and Miss Marple was determined to force it into the open. Tonight she would set a trap, subtle but precise, to provoke a reaction that might reveal the killer. The hotel buzzed with an uneasy normalcy, guests clinging to the veneer of holiday cheer despite the shadow of tragedy. Miss Marple, dressed in a lavender frock and her straw hat, descended to the dining terrace for breakfast, her cane tapping a steady rhythm. The morning was bright, the sea a dazzling turquoise, but the atmosphere was strained. Tim Kendall moved. Among the tables, his smile fixed, but his eyes restless, as if anticipating a blow. Molly, pale and fragile, sat beside him, her hands trembling as she lifted a glass of juice. Miss Marple noted the way Tim's gaze lingered on her, a mix of concern and calculation. The Dysons were at their usual table, Greg's voice subdued, Lucky's laughter sharp and artificial, her eyes flicking toward Tim with a familiarity that set Miss Marple's instincts humming. The Hillingdons, as ever, were isolated, Evelyn's pen scratching in her notebook, Edward's face a mask of quiet tension. Miss Marple's plan took shape over breakfast, inspired by a memory of St. Mary Mead, where a whispered rumour had once flushed a thief from hiding. She needed to provoke the murderer, to make them fear exposure without revealing her own hand. The photograph, she was certain, was the key, its absence a silent accusation. If she could convince the killer it had been found, their reaction might betray them. She began by planting a seed, choosing Dr. Graham as her unwitting ally. During a morning chat in the lounge, she mentioned Palgrave's stories, her tone casual. "He was so eager to share that photograph," she said, her eyes on the doctor's face. "I found a curious picture tucked in one of his books, quite intriguing. I've locked it in my room for safekeeping." Dr. Graham's brow furrowed, but he nodded absently. "Sounds like Palgrave's nonsense. Be careful with old papers, Miss Marple." She smiled, noting his lack of curiosity. The bait was set, and she ensured it reached the right ears. Miss Marple positioned herself near the bar, where Lucky Dyson was sipping a mimosa, her sunglasses perched on her head. Raising her voice slightly, she repeated the tale to a passing waiter, ensuring Lucky overheard. "It's a striking photograph," she said, "hidden in a book the Major lent me. I'll show it to the inspector tomorrow." Lucky's glass paused midway to her lips, her posture stiffening. Miss Marple, pretending to fuss with her shawl, caught the flicker of alarm in her eyes before she masked it with a laugh. The seed was planted, and Miss Marple was certain Lucky would act, whether to search, to confront, or to flee. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, the air thick with the scent of frangipani. She paused by a bench, ostensibly to rest, but her true purpose was to observe. Tim Kendall emerged from the office, his stride brisk as he spoke with a local policeman, not Inspector Daventry, but a subordinate taking notes. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple caught the word toxin and Tim's sharp gesture of dismissal. She recalled Victoria's poisoning, the almond-like smell, and wondered if Tim's agitation stemmed from fear of discovery or involvement. Nearby, Molly sat under a palm, her sketchbook open but her hands idle, her eyes following Tim with a mix of longing and dread. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "Such a lovely spot, Mrs. Kendall," she said. Molly started, her voice faint. "Yes, it's peaceful." But her trembling fingers betrayed her fear, and Miss Marple sensed she was a pawn in a larger game. At luncheon, Miss Marple joined the Hillingdons, her presence unassuming but her ears alert. Evelyn's commentary was crisp, her sketches meticulous, while Edward's responses were monosyllabic, his gaze distant. Miss Marple mentioned Victoria's death, her tone sympathetic. "Such a tragedy. I heard the poison was unusual. Perhaps a plant, like those you study, Mrs. Hillingdon." Evelyn's pen stilled, her eyes narrowing. "Unlikely, Miss Marple. Natural toxins require expertise to extract." Her tone was cool, but Miss Marple caught a defensive edge, as if the question had brushed a hidden truth. Edward shifted, his fingers drumming the table, and Miss Marple wondered if their marriage concealed a shared secret or a shared guilt. The afternoon brought a new clue. Miss Marple, lingering near the pool, overheard a tense exchange between Greg Dyson and Tim Kendall. "You're playing a dangerous game," Greg said, his voice low, his broad frame looming over Tim. Tim's reply was sharp. "Keep your nose out of it, Dyson. You don't know the half." They parted as Miss Marple approached, her presence unnoticed. The argument, coupled with Lucky's watchfulness, suggested a conspiracy, perhaps tied to the hotel's finances or a personal betrayal. Miss Marple filed the exchange away, her suspicions circling Tim and Lucky, whose interactions hinted at a deeper bond. As evening approached, Miss Marple prepared her trap. She left her room's door slightly ajar, a desk drawer open with papers scattered to suggest a recent search. She placed a folded postcard, innocuous but similar in size to a photograph, prominently on the desk, then retreated behind a heavy curtain, her breathing steady despite her racing pulse. The hotel was quiet, the dinner dance not yet begun, and the corridor echoed with distant footsteps. She waited, her senses attuned to every sound, her mind replaying Palgrave's story. A murderer who poisoned his wife, captured in a photograph now lost. If the killer believed she held it, they would come. The clock ticked past 9 when a shadow crossed the threshold. Miss Marple, hidden in the folds of the curtain, held her breath as a figure entered, moving with cautious grace. The dim light revealed Lucky Dyson, her blonde hair tucked under a scarf, her hands gloved to avoid prints. She approached the desk, her movements swift as she rifled through the papers, pausing at the postcard. Her breath caught, and she unfolded it, her face tightening as she realized it was not the photograph. Miss Marple watched, her heart pounding, as Lucky's eyes darted around the room, searching for another hiding place. Satisfied the room held no threat, she slipped out, her footsteps fading into the night. Miss Marple emerged, her mind alight with confirmation. Lucky's presence was no surprise, but her urgency suggested desperation. The photograph, if it existed, was a danger to her, perhaps proof of a past crime, as Palgrave had claimed. Miss Marple straightened the desk, her trap successful but incomplete. She needed more to confront Lucky, to force the truth into the open. The dinner dance was in full swing when Miss Marple joined the guests, the terrace aglow with lanterns and the scent of spiced rum. She took a seat near the bar, her lemonade untouched as she observed the crowd. Tim Kendall was omnipresent, his charm restored, but his glances toward Lucky were furtive, laden with meaning. Molly, present but fragile, moved among the tables, her smile forced, her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple recalled her collapse, the possibility of slow poisoning, and then wondered if Lucky and Tim were orchestrating her demise. The Hillingdons, at their usual table, were silent. Evelyn's sketches abandoned, Edward's whiskey glass clutched tightly. Greg Dyson, animated by drink, danced with a guest, while Lucky watched Tim, her fingers toying with her necklace. Seizing the moment Miss Marple approached Lucky during a lull in the music, her tone conversational. "Such a lively evening," she said, her eyes meeting Lucky's. "I've been sorting through my things, you know, and found the most curious item, a photograph tucked in a book. It reminded me of poor Major Palgrave's stories." Lucky's smile froze, her hand tightening on her glass. "Oh, he was always spinning tales," she said, her voice light but strained. "Nothing worth keeping." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but she caught the panic in Lucky's eyes, the way her gaze flicked toward Tim. The confrontation was brief, but it confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Lucky feared the photograph, and her fear was a chink in her armour. Miss Marple next sought Inspector Daventry, who stood by the terrace's edge, his notebook tucked away. "A distressing time," she said, her voice soft. "I've been thinking about that photograph the Major mentioned. If it were found, it might shed light on these tragedies." Daventry's eyes sharpened, his interest piqued. "You've seen it, Miss Marple?" She shook her head, her tone regretful. "Not yet, but I believe it exists. Someone may be desperate to keep it hidden." Daventry nodded, his skepticism tempered by respect. "We'll look into it. Keep your doors locked, ma'am." Miss Marple smiled, her hint planted. The inspector, she hoped, would follow the trail she had laid. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. The night was warm, the distant drums a faint pulse. Her knitting lay forgotten as she reviewed the night's events. Lucky's search, her panic, Tim's furtive glances, Molly's fragility. The trap had worked, revealing Lucky as a key player, but the puzzle was incomplete. Palgrave's photograph, she was certain, depicted a murderer, likely Lucky, given her actions, and its discovery had sparked a chain of violence. Victoria's death was a consequence, her sharp eyes catching something incriminating. Molly's condition suggested she was the next target, her demise planned to secure a prize, perhaps the hotel, or freedom for Tim and Lucky. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Hillingdons. Evelyn's botanical knowledge and Edward's tension hinted at involvement. perhaps as witnesses or unwilling accomplices. Their silence was a fortress, but fortresses could be breached. She recalled Edward's clash with Greg's warning to Tim, and wondered if the men were entangled in the same web. The photograph was the linchpin, its absence a silent accusation. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The Golden Palms was a chessboard, and she had moved a key piece. The murderer, rattled by her trap, would act again, but she was ready. The night deepened, the hotel cloaked in silence. Miss Marple, her resolve unyielding, knew the endgame was near. The truth was close, hidden in the interplay of fear and deceit, and Jane Marple, unassuming and relentless, would bring it to light. Chapter 8. The Unravelling. The Caribbean dawn broke over St. Honoré with a fiery glow, painting the Golden Palms Hotel in shades of crimson and gold. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her balcony with a steaming cup of tea, watched the first rays touch the hibiscus gardens, her frail frame wrapped in a light shawl. The events of the past days, Major Palgrave's death, Victoria's poisoning, Molly Kendall's collapse, and the trap she had set for Lucky Dyson, had sharpened her instincts to a razor's edge. Her knitting, a soft tangle of pink wool, lay, forgotten on the wicker table. Her mind was her weapon now, stitching together the threads of deceit that wove through the hotel. Last night's gambit had confirmed Lucky's guilt, but the puzzle was incomplete. Today, Miss Marple would press her advantage, unravelling the conspiracy she suspected linked Lucky and Tim Kendall in a deadly plot. The hotel stirred with a brittle calm, guests moving through their routines as if to ward off the spectre of tragedy. Miss Marple, dressed in a crisp linen frock and her straw hat, descended to the dining terrace, her cane tapping a deliberate rhythm. The morning was vibrant, the sea a dazzling turquoise, but an undercurrent of tension pulsed beneath the surface. Tim Kendall was at his post, his charm a polished mask, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of strain as he greeted guests. Molly, pale and fragile, sat at a corner table, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on her untouched fruit plate. Miss Marple noted the way Tim's attention lingered on her, a blend of solicitude and unease that hinted at deeper motives. The Dysons were subdued, Greg's usual bluster absent, Lucky's smile tight as she sipped her coffee. Her sunglasses hiding eyes Miss Marple knew were watchful. The Hillingdons, as ever, were a study in restraint, Evelyn's notebook open, but her pen idle, Edward's face etched with a quiet anguish. Miss Marple's first move was to consolidate her findings with Inspector Daventry, whose growing respect for her insights made him a crucial ally. She found him near the reception desk, reviewing a report with a subordinate. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Might I have a word?" Daventry nodded, dismissing his colleague, and led her to a quiet alcove. Miss Marple, her tone measured, outlined her suspicions. Palgrave's death was no accident, sparked by his recognition of a murderer from his past, likely depicted in the missing photograph. Victoria's poisoning followed her discovery of something incriminating, and Molly's fragility suggested a slow, deliberate poisoning, aimed at securing control of the hotel. "I believe Mr. Kendall and Mrs. Dyson are at the heart of it," she said, her eyes meeting Daventry's. Their interactions, subtle but telling, suggest a personal connection, perhaps an affair, with motives tied to wealth or freedom. Daventry's brow furrowed, his scepticism tempered by her logic. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. Have you evidence?" She admitted her trap, Lucky's nocturnal search of her room, but urged a search of Tim's office. "You may find something concrete," she said, planting the seed without revealing her full hand. Daventry agreed to investigate, and Miss Marple withdrew, her mind racing. The inspector's caution was understandable, but his willingness to act was a step forward. She next sought to observe the guests, hoping their reactions would betray further clues. On the terrace, she joined Dr. Graham for a mid-morning coffee, his genial manner a contrast to the hotel's darker currents. "Mrs. Kendall seems unwell," she said, her tone concerned. "Could it be more than nerves, Doctor?" Graham sighed, his silver hair catching the light. "I've suspected as much. Her symptoms, fatigue, tremors, disorientation, could indicate poisoning, though I've no proof yet. I'm running tests." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The confirmation of poisoning strengthened her theory, and she resolved to protect Molly, whose life hung in the balance. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple took a slow walk through the hotel gardens, the air thick with the scent of oleander and salt. She paused by a fountain, ostensibly to rest, but her true purpose was to watch. Tim Kendall emerged from the office, his stride tense as he spoke with Jim, the gardener, whose guarded demeanour Miss Marple had noted earlier. Their voices were low, but she caught the phrase "keep it quiet" before they noticed her and fell silent. Tim flashed a smile, but it was strained, his eyes darting toward the hotel. Miss Marple nodded politely, her suspicions deepening. Jim's involvement, however minor, suggested a network of complicity, perhaps coerced by Tim or Lucky. At luncheon, Miss Marple joined the Dysons, her presence unassuming, but her ears alert. Greg was gruff, his appetite hearty despite the sombre mood, while Lucky's laughter was forced, her fingers toying with her necklace as she glanced at Tim, who was serving drinks. Miss Marple, steering the conversation to Palgrave, mentioned his storytelling. "He was so vivid, wasn't he?" she said, her tone light. "That tale about a murderer, it stayed with me." Lucky's fork paused, her smile faltering. "It was a bore," she said, her voice sharp. "All talk, no substance." Greg grunted, oblivious. But Miss Marple noted Lucky's unease, a mirror of her panic the previous night. The photograph, she was certain, was a threat to Lucky, a relic of a past she could not escape. The afternoon brought a breakthrough. Inspector Daventry, acting on Miss Marple's suggestion, searched Tim Kendall's office while Tim was occupied with a delivery. Miss Marple, lingering near the reception desk under the guise of inquiring about a tour, overheard Daventry's low conversation with a subordinate. "Found something," he said, his voice tight. "A vial, hidden in a ledger. Looks like plant extract, nightshade maybe." Miss Marple's heart raced. The vial, if it matched the toxin that killed Victoria, was the evidence she needed. She recalled Evelyn Hillingdon's mention of nightshade, her guarded demeanour, and wondered if her expertise had been exploited, or if she was more deeply involved. Daventry summoned Tim to the office, and Miss Marple positioned herself in the lounge, her book open but unread, as she watched the confrontation unfold through the open door. Tim's face was pale, his hands clenching as Daventry held up the vial. Care to explain this, Mr. Kendall? The inspector asked, his tone steely. Tim's voice was unsteady. I've never seen it before. Someone must have planted it. But his eyes, wild with fear, told a different story. Daventry pressed, further, mentioning the photograph, and Tim's composure cracked. I don't know anything about a picture, he snapped, but his voice trembled. Miss Marple, observing silently, knew he was lying. The vial was a link, but the photograph was the key. Sensing the net tightening, Miss Marple sought Lucky Dyson, hoping to provoke a final revelation. She found her by the pool, reclining under an umbrella, her sunglasses hiding her eyes. A lovely day, Mrs. Dyson, Miss Marple said, settling nearby. Though I confess I'm troubled by recent events. That photograph I mentioned, it's caused quite a stir. Lucky's posture stiffened, her lips pursing. You're wasting your time, Miss Marple, she said, her voice cold. There's no photograph. But her hands betrayed her, twisting the strap of her bag. Miss Marple pressed gently. Perhaps, but the police seem to think otherwise. They're searching now. Lucky's face paled, and she rose abruptly, muttering an excuse as she hurried toward the hotel. Miss Marple watched her go, her trap bearing fruit. The evening brought the climax. Daventry, acting on a tip from Miss Marple, searched Lucky's room while she was at dinner. Miss Marple, seated on the terrace with a glass of lemonade, observed the guests, her eyes never still. Tim was absent, detained by Daventry, while Molly, under Dr. Graham's care, remained in her room. The Hillingdons were at their usual table, Evelyn's sketches resumed, Edward's whisky glass untouched. Greg Dyson, alone, drank heavily, his eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple sensed the unravelling, the moment when secrets could no longer be contained. Daventry emerged, his face grim, holding a small envelope. He approached Miss Marple, his voice low. You were right, Mum. We found it in Mrs. Dyson's jewellery case. A photograph, old but clear. It shows a younger woman, strikingly like her, with a man Palgrave claimed was a murderer. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alight. The photograph, as she had suspected, was the catalyst, its discovery sparking Palgrave's death and the subsequent cover-up. Daventry moved to detain Lucky, who was returning from the bar, her face paling as she saw the inspector. Mrs. Dyson, a word, he said, his tone unyielding. Lucky's eyes darted, seeking escape, but the terrace was crowded, and Daventry's grip was firm. The confrontation unfolded in the hotel's conference room, with Miss Marple present at Daventry's invitation. Lucky, cornered, maintained her defiance, her voice sharp. You've got nothing on me, she snapped, her sunglasses discarded, revealing eyes bright with fear. Daventry held up the photograph, its edges worn, but the image clear. A young woman, unmistakably Lucky, beside a man in a suit. Palgrave recognized you, Daventry said. He knew you as the wife of a man who died under suspicious circumstances. Poison, wasn't it? Lucky's composure cracked, her hands trembling. That's a lie, she hissed, but her voice faltered. Tim, brought in moments later, crumbled under pressure. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he said, his face ashen. Lucky said Palgrave would ruin everything. He saw her, knew her from before. We just wanted to keep him quiet. Miss Marple, silent but attentive, pieced together the confession. Tim and Lucky, lovers bound by greed, had slipped an overdose into Palgrave's rum, staging his death as heart failure. Victoria, witnessing Lucky near the bungalow, was silenced. With nightshade extract, its source likely Evelyn's botanical knowledge, though she was not directly implicated. Molly's illness was a slow poisoning, intended to culminate in her death, freeing Tim to claim the hotel and a life with Lucky. Lucky, realizing the game was lost, tried to flee, but Daventry's men blocked the door. Her defiance collapsed, and she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "It was all for us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't let him destroy it." Miss Marple, her expression sombre, felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed. The Hillingdons, cleared of direct involvement, were questioned separately, their strained marriage a casualty of unspoken suspicions. Greg Dyson, stunned by Lucky's betrayal, vowed to cooperate with the police. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. The night was warm, the distant waves a steady rhythm. Her knitting lay untouched as she reflected on the unravelling. Lucky's past, exposed by Palgrave's photograph, had driven her to murder, with Tim as her willing accomplice. Molly's survival was a small victory, but the cost was heavy. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. The Golden Palms had been a stage, its players unmasked by her patient persistence. She was an old woman, easily underestimated, but her mind was a beacon, illuminating the darkest corners. The night deepened, the hotel settling into a fragile peace. Miss Marple, her resolve unshaken, knew the truth had been served. The murderer was caught, the innocent spared, and Jane Marple, unassuming and indomitable, had once again brought light to the shadows. Chapter 9. The Confession. The Caribbean sun rose over St. Honoré with a serene brilliance, its rays filtering through the palm fronds to dapple the Golden Palms Hotel in a mosaic of light and shadow. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room's wicker armchair, gazed at the tranquil sea, her frail hands folded over a neatly pressed handkerchief. The events of the previous night, the discovery of the photograph, the confrontation with Lucky Dyson, and Tim Kendall's crumbling admission had brought the hotel's deadly secrets into sharp relief. Her knitting, a soft mound of pink wool, lay untouched on the table. Her mind, ever restless, sifted through the final threads of the puzzle. The murderers were in custody, but Miss Marple knew the full truth required a confession, a bearing of motives and misdeeds that would lay the case to rest. Today she would witness the unravelling of Lucky and Tim's conspiracy, ensuring no shadow of doubt remained. The hotel, though bathed in morning light, hummed with a subdued tension. Guests moved through the dining terrace with hushed voices, their eyes darting toward the police presence near the reception desk. Miss Marple, dressed in a pale grey frock and her straw hat, descended to breakfast, her cane tapping a steady rhythm. The terrace was sparsely populated, the usual chatter replaced by a wary silence. Molly Kendall, recovering under Dr. Graham's care, was absent, her survival a quiet triumph amid the tragedy. Tim Kendall, detained by Inspector Daventry, was nowhere to be seen, and the Dyson's table was empty, Greg having retreated to his room Stunned by Lucky's betrayal, the Hillingdons sat in their customary corner, Evelyn's notebook closed, Edward's face a mask of weary resignation. Miss Marple noted their isolation, sensing their marriage had been strained by the hotel's dark currents, though they were cleared of direct involvement. Miss Marple's first task was to confer with Inspector Daventry, whose pragmatic approach had been bolstered by her insights. She found him in the hotel's conference room, now a makeshift interrogation space, reviewing notes with a subordinate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his stocky frame straightening as she entered. "Your instincts were spot on. That photograph broke the case." She smiled, her expression modest. "I'm glad to have helped, Inspector. Have they spoken further?" Daventry's eyes narrowed. "Kendall's talking, but Dyson's holding out. We're questioning them separately this morning. Care to sit in?" Miss Marple nodded, her presence unassuming but her mind alert. Confession, she knew, would reveal the depth of their plot, and she intended to ensure no detail was overlooked. The interrogation room was stark, its whitewashed walls and wooden table a contrast to the hotel's tropical opulence. Lucky Dyson was brought in first, her blonde hair dishevelled, her sunglasses discarded to reveal eyes red-rimmed with defiance and fear. She sat heavily, her hands cuffed, her posture rigid as Daventry began. "Mrs. Dyson, we have the photograph," he said, sliding the worn image across the table. It showed a younger Lucky, radiant but unmistakable, beside a man in a suit. Her first husband, Palgrave had claimed, poisoned years ago. "Palgrave recognized you," Daventry continued. "He knew you as the widow of a man who died under suspicious circumstances. Care to explain?" Lucky's lips tightened, her voice sharp. "It's a mistake. I'm not that woman." But her trembling hands betrayed her, and Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, saw the cracks in her facade. Daventry pressed further, his tone unyielding. "We found nightshade extract in Kendall's office, matching the toxin that killed Victoria. Your fingerprints were on the vial's hiding place, and Kendall's talking. He says you planned it all." Lucky's eyes widened, a flash of betrayal crossing her face. "Tim's lying," she snapped, but her voice faltered. Miss Marple, silent but attentive, noted the shift. Lucky's defiance was crumbling, her reliance on Tim a weakness Daventry could exploit. The inspector leaned forward, his voice low. "Palgrave was going to expose you. You slipped an overdose into his rum, staged it as heart failure. Victoria saw you near his bungalow, so you poisoned her too. And Molly Kendall, her illness was your doing, wasn't it?" Lucky's face paled, her hands clenching. "You can't prove that," she whispered, but her eyes darted toward the door, seeking escape. Miss Marple, her expression serene, spoke for the first time, her voice soft but piercing. "Mrs. Dyson, you searched my room last night, believing I had the photograph. Why such fear if you're innocent?" Lucky's head snapped toward her, her gaze venomous. "You meddling old woman!" she hissed. But the fight was draining from her. Daventry seized the moment, producing a ledger from Tim's office, its pages marked with coded transactions. These show payments to a local supplier, for nightshade, among other things. "Your signature's here, Mrs. Dyson." Lucky's shoulders slumped, her defiance collapsing. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she murmured, her voice breaking. I just wanted a new life." The confession spilled forth, halting at first, then a torrent. Lucky admitted to her past. As a young woman, she had married a wealthy man, poisoning him with a slow-acting toxin when his affection waned, escaping suspicion in a small American town. She reinvented herself, moving to the Caribbean, where she met Tim Kendall, trapped in a marriage to Molly and desperate for control of the hotel. Their affair ignited a plan: eliminate obstacles, secure the hotel's wealth, and start anew. Palgrave's arrival was a catastrophe. He had known her late husband's lawyer, possessing a photograph from that time. When he began to suspect her identity, Lucky panicked, slipping a lethal dose of barbiturates into his rum during a late-night chat, ensuring his death appeared natural. Victoria, sharp-eyed and curious, had seen Lucky leaving Palgrave's bungalow, her questions threatening exposure. Lucky, using nightshade extract sourced through Tim's contacts, poisoned her, staging it as an accident. Molly's episodes were the final step, laced with small doses of the same toxin, intended to culminate in a fatal collapse, freeing Tim and the hotel's assets. Miss Marple listened, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. Lucky's confession was a mirror of human frailty, greed, fear, and love twisted into violence. Daventry, satisfied, signalled for Lucky to be taken away, her face ashen as she was led out. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tim, whose role was equally damning but driven by different impulses. She remained in the room as he was brought in, his handsome features haggard, his eyes hollow with defeat. Daventry wasted no time, presenting the vial and the ledger. "Your lover's confessed, Kendall," he said, his tone steely. "She says you were in it together. Care to tell your side?" Tim's composure shattered, his hands trembling as he sank into the chair. "I didn't want it to go this far," he said, his voice hoarse. "Lucky, she had a hold on me. Said we could have everything, be free." Miss Marple, silent but watchful, noted the desperation in his tone, the mark of a man swayed by passion and ambition. Tim's confession unfolded, corroborating Lucky's but tinged with regret. He admitted to their affair, kindled by mutual frustration, his with Molly's fragility, hers with Greg's indifference. When Palgrave threatened to expose Lucky, Tim agreed to the plan, procuring the barbiturates and ensuring the hotel staff saw nothing amiss. Victoria's death was harder for him. She was a friend, but Lucky insisted her silence was essential, and Tim, weakened by love, complied, hiding the nightshade in his office. Molly's poisoning was the final act. A slow betrayal Tim justified as mercy, believing her frail health would make her death seem natural. "I loved her, in my way," he said, his voice breaking. "But Lucky, she made it seem right." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her heart ached for Molly, caught in a web of betrayal. Tim's weakness, she saw, was his undoing, his devotion to Lucky blinding him to the moral cost. Daventry, his notebook filled, signalled for Tim to be taken away, his confession complete. Miss Marple rose, her cane steady, and thanked the inspector. "You've done fine work, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. Daventry's lips curved faintly. "Couldn't have done it without you, ma'am. That photograph was the key." She nodded, her modesty genuine, but her satisfaction deep. The truth was out, the guilty exposed, but the cost was heavy. Returning to the terrace, Miss Marple sought solitude, settling in a shaded corner with a glass of lemonade. The hotel was quieter now, the guests' whispers fading as the police presence receded. She reflected on the confessions, piecing together the final details. Lucky's past, a shadow she could not escape, had collided with Palgrave's memory, sparking a chain of violence. Tim, ensnared by love and greed, had been her willing partner, their plan meticulous but flawed by hubris. Victoria's death was a tragic necessity, her sharp eyes a threat they could not ignore. Molly's survival was a testament to Miss Marple's persistence, her trap forcing the killer's hand before the final blow could land. The Hillingdons, though uninvolved, had been peripheral players, their strained marriage a casualty of the hotel's toxic atmosphere. Evelyn's botanical knowledge, Miss Marple suspected, had been unwittingly exploited, the nightshade sourced through local contacts Tim accessed. The afternoon brought a visit from Dr. Graham, who joined her on the terrace, his face weary but relieved. "Molly's improving," he said, his voice warm. "The tests confirmed low levels of nightshade, but we caught it in time. She'll recover thanks to you." Miss Marple smiled, her heart lifting. "I'm glad, Doctor. She's been through too much." Graham nodded, his eyes on the sea. "This place, it brings out the worst in people. I'll be glad to see it behind me." Miss Marple understood. Sensing the hotel's charm was forever tainted by its secrets. As evening approached, the hotel prepared for a subdued dinner. The lanterns dimmed, the calypso band replaced by soft piano music. Miss Marple, in a lavender dress, took her place among the guests, her eyes scanning the diminished crowd. The Hillingdons were present, their silence heavier now. Evelyn's sketches abandoned, Edward's whiskey glass untouched. Greg Dyson, alone, ate mechanically, his face etched with betrayal. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. He was a victim of Lucky's deceit, his trust shattered. She approached him briefly, her tone gentle. "A difficult time, Mr. Dyson," she said. He nodded, his voice gruff. "Didn't see it coming. She fooled me." Miss Marple offered no platitudes, only a quiet nod, knowing time would heal what words could not. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moon casting silver light over the sea. The night was warm, the distant waves a steady rhythm. Her knitting lay untouched as she reflected on the case. Lucky's calculated cruelty, Tim's weak complicity, Molly's narrow escape. The photograph, a relic of a forgotten crime, had been the spark, its discovery unravelling a conspiracy rooted in greed and desperation. Miss Marple's role, unassuming but pivotal, had brought justice. But she felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of truth restored. The Golden Palms was a stage, its drama concluded, and she, the quiet observer, had rewritten its ending. The night deepened, the hotel settling into a fragile peace. Miss Marple, her resolve unshaken, knew her work was done. The guilty were punished, the innocent spared, and Jane Marple, unassuming and indomitable, had once again pierced the veil of deceit. The Caribbean moon hung low, its light a promise of clarity, and she closed her eyes, ready for whatever puzzle lay beyond. Chapter 10. The Quiet Departure. The Caribbean sun bathed St. Honoré in a golden haze, its warmth softening the edges of the Golden Palms Hotel, where the scars of recent tragedies lingered like shadows beneath the palms. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her balcony with a cup of chamomile tea, gazed at the tranquil sea, her frail hands resting on a neatly folded shawl. The unravelling of Tim Kendall and Lucky Dyson's deadly plot, sparked by Major Palgrave's recognition of a past crime, fueled by greed and betrayal, and culminating in the confessions that had spared Molly Kendall's life, had restored a fragile peace to the hotel. Her knitting, a soft heap of pink wool, lay untouched on the wicker table. Her mind, ever vigilant, reflected on the human frailties that had woven this dark tapestry. Today, as she prepared to leave the island, Miss Marple sought closure, ensuring the final threads of the case were tied before she returned to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. The hotel stirred with a tentative calm, guests reclaiming their routines as the police presence dwindled. Miss Marple, dressed in a pale blue frock and her straw hat, descended to the dining terrace for breakfast, her cane tapping a gentle rhythm. The terrace was brighter now, the clatter of cutlery and murmur of conversation signalling a return to normalcy, though the absence of Tim and Lucky cast a subtle void. Molly Kendall, recovering under Dr. Graham's care, sat at a small table, her delicate features softened by a tentative smile. Miss Marple noted the faint colour in her cheeks, a sign of healing, though her eyes still held a flicker of fragility. The Hillingdons were at their usual corner, Evelyn's notebook open but her pen still, Edward's gaze less guarded, as if the weight of suspicion had lifted. Greg Dyson, alone, ate mechanically, his broad shoulders slumped, his face etched with the sting of betrayal. Miss Marple's first task was to visit Molly, whose survival was a testament to her persistence. She approached her table, her smile grandmotherly. "You're looking stronger, Mrs. Kendall," she said, settling beside her. Molly's eyes welled with tears, her voice soft. "I owe you so much, Miss Marple. If you hadn't, I wouldn't be here." She reached out, her hand trembling, and Miss Marple patted it gently, her heart warmed by the young woman's gratitude. "Nonsense, my dear. You're a fighter, and Dr. Graham's care did the rest." Molly shook her head, her voice breaking. "Tim, I never saw it, never suspected, and Lucky, she was my friend." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sombre. Betrayal, she knew, cut deeper than poison, but Molly's resilience would carry her forward. They spoke briefly of the future. Molly's plan to sell her share of the hotel, to start anew elsewhere. And Miss Marple offered quiet encouragement, sensing the young woman's strength returning. Leaving Molly, Miss Marple sought Dr. Graham, whose medical vigilance had been crucial. She found him in the hotel's lounge, reviewing a guest's chart, his silver hair catching the morning light. "Good morning, Doctor," she said, her tone warm. "I hear Mrs. Kendall is making fine progress." Graham smiled, his weariness tempered by relief. "She's out of danger, thank heaven." The nightshade was administered in small doses, meant to mimic illness. "We caught it just in time." Miss Marple nodded, her mind revisiting the case. Lucky's calculated dosing, Tim's complicity, the vial hidden in his office. "You've done splendid work," she said. And Graham's eyes met hers, a mutual respect passing between them. couldn't have done it without your nudge, Miss Marple. You've a knack for seeing what others miss." She demurred, her modesty genuine, but her satisfaction was deep. The doctor's confirmation closed another loop, ensuring Molly's recovery was secure. The morning progressed, and Miss Marple took a final walk through the hotel gardens, the air thick with the scent of frangipani and salt. She paused by a cluster of hibiscus, their scarlet blooms a vivid contrast to the green, and reflected on the case's resolution. Palgrave's photograph, a relic of Lucky's past crime, had been the spark. His recognition of her as a murderer setting off a chain of violence. Victoria's sharp eyes, catching Lucky near the bungalow, had made her a target. Her death a desperate act to preserve the secret. Molly's poisoning, slow and insidious, was the final step, designed to secure the hotel's wealth for Tim and Lucky's new life. Miss Marple's trap, her feigned discovery of the photograph, had forced their hand, leading to the vial's discovery and the confessions that followed. The Hillingdons, though uninvolved, had been peripheral figures. Their strained marriage a casualty of the hotel's toxic atmosphere. Evelyn's botanical knowledge an unwitting tool in the killer's hands. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a chance encounter with Greg Dyson, who stood by the cliffs staring at the sea. His broad frame was hunched, his face haggard, the weight of Lucky's betrayal etched in his eyes. She approached, her voice gentle. "A difficult time, Mr. Dyson," she said, pausing beside him. He nodded, his voice gruff. "Didn't see her for what she was. Thought I knew her." Miss Marple's heart ached for his pain, though she knew his temper had masked his own flaws. "People can hide their true selves," she said, her tone kind. "But you'll find your way." Greg's lips twitched, a faint acknowledgement, and he promised to look after Molly as a friend, a gesture Miss Marple sensed was sincere. She left him to his thoughts, her mind noting the human cost of the case, not just lives lost, but trusts shattered. At luncheon, Miss Marple joined the Hillingdons, sensing their departure was imminent and seeking to understand their role. Evelyn's reserve was softer now. Her sketches resumed, while Edward's silence was less oppressive, as if the truth's exposure had eased a private burden. "You're leaving soon, I hear?" Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. Evelyn nodded, her voice crisp but warmer. "Tomorrow, the island's lost its charm." Edward's eyes met hers, a flicker of agreement passing between them. Miss Marple, probing gently, mentioned the case. "Such a tragedy, all sparked by a photograph. Did you ever hear Major Palgrave's tales?" Evelyn's pen paused, her expression guarded but not defensive. He rambled on, but I paid little mind. His stories seemed fanciful. Edward, speaking for the first time, added he was a bore. Didn't think he'd stir up such trouble. Miss Marple smiled, sensing their detachment was genuine, their tension rooted in personal strains rather than guilt. Their marriage, she suspected, would endure, though scarred by the island's shadows. The afternoon brought a final meeting with Inspector Daventry, who sought her out on the terrace, his notebook tucked away. "You're leaving us, Miss Marple," he said, his stocky frame relaxed, a rare smile on his face. "The island owes you a debt." She demurred, her voice soft. "I only pointed the way, Inspector. Your diligence did the rest." Daventry shook his head, his respect evident. "You saw what we missed. The photograph, the connections. Kendall and Dyson are facing charges, and Molly's safe. That's your doing." Miss Marple nodded, her satisfaction tempered by the case's cost. She inquired about the photograph, now evidence, and Daventry confirmed its significance. A snapshot from Lucky's past, tying her to a husband's suspicious death, its discovery by Palgrave, the catalyst for murder. The inspector's gratitude was heartfelt, and Miss Marple left him with a quiet nod, her role complete. As evening approached, the hotel prepared for a subdued farewell dinner. The lanterns dimmed, the music a soft guitar melody. Miss Marple, in a lavender dress, took her place among the guests, her eyes scanning the diminished crowd. Molly was present, her smile tentative but genuine, a sign of her healing. The Hillingdons, packing for their departure, ate quickly, their silence a mutual agreement to move on. Greg Dyson, alone, kept his distance, his face a mask of resolve. Miss Marple felt a quiet contentment. The hotel, though scarred, was healing, its guests free to rebuild what the killers had torn apart. Packing her suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the case's broader lessons. Human nature, she knew, was a constant, its virtues and vices unchanged, by setting. Greed had driven Lucky, weakness Tim, their love a twisted justification for violence. Molly's trust, Greg's blindness, the Hillingdons' reticence, all were facets of the same frail humanity she had seen in St. Mary Mead. Yet kindness too had prevailed. Molly's resilience, Graham's care, Daventry's diligence. Miss Marple's role, unassuming but pivotal, was to shine a light, to reveal the truth beneath the masks. She folded her knitting, its pink strands a reminder of her quiet persistence, and closed her suitcase, ready for home. The airport was a modest affair, its single runway fringed by palms. Miss Marple, waiting for her flight, watched the island recede, its beauty undimmed by its secrets. The plane rose, the sea a glittering expanse below, and she smiled faintly, her mind already turning to St. Mary Mead's familiar rhythms. The Caribbean had been a stage, its drama resolved, and she, the quiet observer, had played her part. The puzzles of home, gossip, feuds, small betrayals, awaited, and Jane Marple, unassuming and indomitable, was ready to meet them. The sky stretched endless above, a canvas of blue and gold. Miss Marple closed her eyes, the hum of the engines a lullaby, and let the island fade, its lessons etched in her heart. The truth, she knew, was her compass, and wherever it led she would follow.